Hello, everyone. Welcome to our weekly seminar. Today is Hinamatsuri, or the so-called Girls' Day in Japan, and a friend in the Tokyo area sent me photos. I don't think meaning to mock me or be passive aggressive toward me, but of beautiful plum blossoms, just like a sea of plum blossoms. And I sent back a photo of a sea of frozen puddles. Like that. Anyway, one of these days, spring will come even to Cambridge, I hope. Anyway, I am David Howell. I teach in the History and East Asian Languages and Civilizations departments here at Harvard. And I'm also serving as the acting director of the program on U.S.-Japan relations this year. Today's seminar is co-sponsored by the Edwin O. Reischauer Institute for Japanese Studies. It's my pleasure to serve both as moderator and to introduce our speaker, Professor Kristin Roebuck, who's an assistant professor in the Department of History and Howard Milstein Faculty Fellow at Cornell University. She studies modern Japanese history, focusing on such areas as medicine, race and gender, war, and enslavement. I met Kristin for the first time in person yesterday, though we had actually collaborated on a project several years ago. We were supposed to have met then, but COVID came, and up until now, our interactions have all been either over Zoom or by email. So it's finally great to have a living dimensional human person to interact with. So I'm delighted that she was able to join us today. Professor Roebuck is the author of Japan Reborn, Race, Sex, and Eugenics from World War to Cold War, which is under contract with Columbia University Press. Her other publications include Orphans by Design, Mixed-Blood Children, Child Welfare and Racial Nationalism in Post-War Japan, published in Japanese Studies in 2016. Remember Girl Zero, Asia Pacific Patrilineal and Female Slavery, part of the project that we collaborated on, published in the Harvard Journal of Asiatic Studies in 2021, and Science Without Borders, War, Empire, and the Contested Science of Race Mixing in Japan, East Asia, and the West in Who is the Asianist? Columbia University Press, 2022. And so please join me in welcoming Kristin Roebuck.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Dr. Howell. I want to also thank Pierce Langdon, who I understand is on leave now, but did a lot of work organizing this talk and bringing me to Cambridge. And also thank Dr. Fujikita, who picked up where Pierce Langdon left off and has provided a very warm welcome. So thank you all also for attending. What I'm going to be doing today is introducing my book, which is dig in deep to what happens in the last chapter before my epilogue, where the book shifts its focus to U.S.-Japan relations, which I thought would be the most appropriate part of the book to discuss in this forum. So, at the height of Japan's imperial expansion from the late 1930s to the 1940s, Japanese policymakers, scholars, and mass media all shone a really intense spotlight on konketsuji, or mixed-blood children. And this was a population that was deemed both biologically and politically significant. Most Japanese commentators in that era, the imperial era, discovered in hybrid children evidence that race mixing was good for the body of the child and good for the body politic, too. In my book, I explore how imperial Japanese constructed themselves as a mixed blood people with a world historical gift for assimilating diverse others at a time of rapid imperial expansion. But after defeat and the loss of empire in World War II, the Japanese began reconstructing themselves rather rapidly as a pure and endogamous race. To explain this shift in racial national identity, I focus on the figure of the mixed-blood child, sometimes eulogized, later more often demonized. I argue that it's through the bodies of mixed-blood children and their Japanese mothers that the borders of the Japanese race and nation are drawn and defended. During the imperial era, konketsuji were often imagined as the offspring of Japanese soldiers advancing into foreign lands and impregnating foreign women. And for this reason, they were often embraced and celebrated as proof of imperial virility and the expanding borders of the biopolitical organism that was the Japanese race. But the fact that most konketsuji born after 1945 were sired by soldiers from enemy armies who conquered and occupied Japan forever changed the meaning of blood mixing. Defeat, occupation, and post-war alliance with the erstwhile enemy, the United States, sparked a broad negative reaction against blood mixing and a profound devolution in the social status of the mixed blood child, along with his Japanese mother. And I'll just note that this photograph is taken from a race scientific study that was conducted on mixed blood children born after World War II. I talk a great deal about race scientific research and eugenic research in my book. I'm not going to dig into that very deeply in my talk today, but I'm happy to take questions about it if people want more information on that. What you see here is the hand of the researcher, Japanese researcher, positioning the child's head so that they can home in. They're really interested in the shape of his ear as a marker of a racial difference and potentially of eugenic consequence. So, in May 1952, Japan emerged from 6.5 years of Allied occupation, free, peaceful, and democratic, with a rapidly expanding economy to boot. It was in many ways a revolutionary moment, but not always a celebratory one. In fact, what Japanese protesters and presses often conveyed at this moment of liberation was outrage, recrimination, and dire warnings about the future and the state in which the Allies, and above all the Americans, had left Japan. In fact, chief among the bitter topics of recrimination in Japan was the fact that US soldiers had not left Japan at all. So as many of you will know, on the very same day that Japan signed, so here this is Liberal Party leader, Prime Minister Yoshida Shigeru, and here his protege and future Prime Minister Ikeda Hayato in San Francisco signing the multilateral San Francisco Peace Treaty. That very same day, Yoshida Shigeru also signed a bilateral security agreement with the United States, the ANPO Treaty, which provided for the continued stationing of US troops in Japan, practice that continues to this day. So when the occupation ended, but US troops stayed on, Japanese press marked the occasion by declaring a state of crisis, specifically what was known as the mixed blood children crisis. That crisis revolved around children who were fathered by foreign soldiers stationed in Japan and mothered by Japanese women, the women of the defeated nation. As one prominent periodical put it in 1952, quote, "The konketsuji born from these unhappy relations are mostly abandoned and end up orphans. In 6.5 years of occupation, 200,000 international orphans have been born." So from May 1952 onward, all of a sudden, the number 200,000 and the phrase konketsuji mondai, or mixed blood children crisis, was apparently on every tongue in the pages of every periodical and bandied about in debates on the Diet floor. The Liberal Party of this prime minister, was under siege, the target of nationwide outrage for allegedly abetting American soldiers in siring and abandoning hundreds of thousands of children in Japan. Now, at the time, Japanese welfare institutions were already massively overwhelmed with children who had been orphaned or been rendered homeless in the final stages of Japan's lost war. In 1947, the Ministry of Welfare counted 123,511 homeless and orphaned children nationwide. And the late 1940s see a nationwide campaign to sweep these children off the streets and get them, in some cases, reunited with family, often when that's not possible, into institutions. And so there's a big boom in building orphanages or converting older military facilities into childcare facilities for children like these. Yet despite the profusion of, so-called pure blood orphans, in 1953, one expert speculated in the Diet in his expert testimony that konketsuji must comprise a staggering 20% of all children in Japan's welfare institutions. Opposition politicians and mainstream media repeatedly voiced the demand of the Japanese people that America take responsibility for the children it had, quote, left behind. And the language of the day, the common rhetoric of the day, was almost always the case, that the language was that the Americans had left behind their children rather than Japanese women had kept behind their own children. So what most people meant when they demanded in this very common post-war phrase that the United States take responsibility for Konketsuji was that the United States should take Konketsuji themselves out of Japan. To give just one instance of this kind of talk, a counselor from the Japan Socialist Party by the name of Yamashita Gishin demanded from the Diet floor in February 1952 that all US troops depart Japan, and furthermore that they take all mixed-blood children with them. You hear a lot of similar comments made by other Japan Socialist Party members at the time, but also by members of the right-wing Democratic Party, such as future Prime Minister Nakasone Yasuhiro. Often, Japanese politicians and pundits at the time argued that mass deportation was in the best interests of mixed-blood children themselves, because they needed to live with, quote, people of their own race. Their racial bonds with other Japanese and their bonds with their Japanese mothers were routinely and categorically denied. So it probably won't surprise you to hear that the United States never contemplated effecting the mass removal of Konketsuji from the country. In fact, such a scheme seems so unlikely and so legally problematic that it's hard to resist the conclusion that Japanese calls for mass relocation of Konketsuji were not always serious policy proposals designed to solve a putative crisis in child welfare. Very often, they were rhetorical feints aimed at embarrassing the United States and its friends in Japan, specifically the ruling Liberal Party, at discrediting the US-Japan security alliance, and elevating politicians more hostile to that alliance and more sympathetic to US rivals in the Cold War. In fact, the very first politicians to stand up in the Diet and start making a political issue about Konketsuji were members of the Japan Communist Party. So, the US-Japan alliance did not crumble under this rhetorical assault, but strain and embarrassment were keenly felt on both sides of the Pacific. American media began covering the problem as early as 1948. Where do I aim this? There we go. All right. So this is the earliest US news report that I've found on the emerging Konketsuji crisis. And actually, the United States media starts publishing on this a little bit sooner than the Japanese media, because in 1948, Japanese media were still under US occupation and subject to US censorship. The Japanese news media start publishing this with this problem with great abundance by 1952 when the occupation ends, but they're a little bit slow, a little bit hesitant in the late 1940s. If you look around more broadly at American media, you have, for example, this is the Cleveland Call and Post, self-described as Cleveland's Black news leader. So you have the Black press in the United States. And this is from 1951, focusing front page story on how the stork adds to the horrors of war. Babes of tan Yanks unwanted in Japan. And by 1952, you have this from the Washington Post. Future pales for 100,000 children rejected by Japanese and shunned by Americans. The exact number of children who were said to be affected in this crisis varied wildly, from 75,000 up to 200,000 and rising. One thing I'll point out, at the top left of this story in the Washington Post is a woman by the name of Sawada Miki, who played a really prominent role. I'm going to describe her role in this so-called Konketsuji crisis later in my talk. For now, suffice it to say that by the early 1950s, American church groups, journalists, diplomats, and legislators has all taken a lively interest in Japan's mixed-blood children problem. Neither American officials nor the American public were willing to entertain the solution most ardently advanced in Japan, namely the removal of all US troops, along with all of the children that they were blamed for spawning. But Japanese reports did convince American audiences that the crisis was real, and furthermore, that it was America's crisis to solve. Otherwise, this new security alliance with Japan, the United States' key Cold War outpost in Asia, might crumble. In October 1953, a congressional subcommittee arrived in Tokyo to survey the scene. American Consul General James Pilcher gave the subcommittee a detailed briefing in which he complained of the, quote, misinformation and, quote, grossly exaggerated rhetoric that were distorting the US image in Japan. For one thing, he said, there were nowhere near 200,000 children sired and orphaned by Americans in Japan. Investigations by Japan's Ministry of Welfare turned up closer to 493. And not all of those had American fathers, but that was the number of mixed blood children that they could find in orphanages and child welfare facilities nationwide. But that number never circulated as widely in Japanese news reports or in international news reports. And this is a story that's being covered, as I pointed out, in American presses, but you can also find it in the Times of India. You can find it in Italian, in British, and it is a global news story that is distorting America's image, and American policymakers and diplomats are keenly concerned about it. So regardless of the actual numbers, which never circulate very widely, Pilcher noted, quote, "The Japanese people would probably like to see most of these babies adopted by Americans." And so the United States stumbled toward international adoption as its own preferred solution to the Konketsuji crisis. In lieu of mass removal, it would be case-by-case removal. To the chagrin of American policymakers, case-by-case removal was never enough to satisfy America's critics in Japan, but international adoption could satisfy American audiences that the United States was living up to its responsibilities, exhibiting moral leadership, and doing something to save what the Los Angeles Times called, quote, Japan's unwanted. International adoption was a novel concept at the time, and it took years of policy innovation and private experimentation to figure out how it would work. One key moment came in 1952 with passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act. The INA repealed the racial bar on Japanese immigration and naturalization that had been in force in the United States since 1924. Repeal of that old racist provision in American law was an important plank in the platform of trans-Pacific rapprochement, and reconciliation with all possible allies felt urgently necessary in the wake of the fall of China, North Korea, and Eastern Europe to communism. Now, the thing about the INA was that although it abolished the old, absolute bar on immigration of people with 50% or more Japanese blood, which would include Konketsuji, it replaced that absolute bar with a very small quota. Just 185 people per year were permitted to immigrate through that quota to the United States. Obviously, that's not sufficient to solve a crisis like this. So Americans went on debating how far to liberalize immigration as a whole, and Japanese went on complaining that they had not gone far enough. Meanwhile, Congress was busy fashioning all kinds of exceptions to the barriers to immigration that remained on the books. So actually, most immigration is going to be non-quota immigration in this new era. By September of 1953, Congress had passed 349 private bills to grant non-quota visas to Japanese nationals, and most of those were visas that went to orphans. There were many more such private bills to come. A rising tide of public pressure and legislative exhaustion surrounding these case-by-case exceptions to the still restrictive provisions for immigration that were on the books led Congress in 1953 to pass two further public laws providing visas for foreign orphans on a large scale. The first was Public Law 162, which allocated 500 visas for orphans to be adopted by U.S. military and government personnel stationed overseas. So this was an answer to the reality that in the middle of World War II and its aftermath, U.S. troops had often encountered orphans or homeless children and had taken a hand in raising them. And in some cases, at the end of their tour of duty, they wanted to formally adopt those children and bring them back to the United States. Now, under the original law that had been passed in 1924, that would be possible perhaps for a European child, but impossible for a Japanese or a Korean child. After 1952, it would be possible for a Japanese or Korean child, but only if they got a visa through that quota system, which is virtually impossible. So Congress, very responsible to the demands of the public and sensitive to the things that U.S. soldiers and veterans were asking for, decided to pass this bill granting a big chunk of visas. In addition, a few months later, the Refugee Relief Act of 1953 provided a further 4,000 visas for foreign orphans who could be adopted by any Americans. Now, I want to pause for a moment to sort of survey the historiographic sort of scholarly wisdom that I'm building on, but in some ways challenging. So there's been a lot of scholarship on the relationship between Cold War geopolitics and the rise of international adoption in the 1950s. But this scholarly literature overwhelmingly positions Korea and the post-Korean War environment from 1953 onward as the origin point for the American practice of international adoption. Public Law 162, for example, has repeatedly been mischaracterized as designed to facilitate adoption out of Korea. In fact, almost all adoptees under that law came from Japan. 0 came from Korea. Adoption from Korea did commence under the subsequent Refugee Relief Act, but adoptees from Japan and Okinawa still outnumbered them by 3 to 1. So the reason for this dramatic skew was not that America was putting Japanese orphans at the front of the line. The reason was rather that Japan itself was so eager to send its orphans overseas, at least if these children had mixed blood. In fact, pure blood orphans, Japan is quite a bit more reluctant to relinquish. So it's really not, it's really not until the 1960s that Korea takes the lead as the premier sending nation of international adoptees to the United States, which I think helps explain why most of the scholarship has focused on that. It's sort of later development that's misunderstood as the origin point. So in contrast to this familiar bilateral model of the origins of international adoption, I argue that there was a trilateral mechanism, which was designed to manage the biopolitical tension of alliance building between the United States, post-colonial Korea, and post-imperial Japan. Those latter countries were in the process of redefining themselves in the wake of the collapse of the avowedly mixed blood and blood mixing Japanese empire as racially pure and distinct and sovereign peoples. International adoption helped to mediate between the reality that mixture was ongoing under new Cold War alliances with the United States and the racial nationalist backlash against that fact in both South Korea and in Japan. So, no one played a larger role in promoting international adoption as the preferred solution to the Konketsuji crisis from the late 1940s onward than a Christian philanthropist, Japanese philanthropist by the name of Sawada Miki. The eldest daughter of the pre-war leader of the Mitsubishi Zaibatsu and wife of one of Japan's senior diplomats, Sawada Renzo, Sawada Miki had wealth, confidence, political connections, and savvy. She also crucially knew English. In 1948, she leveraged those assets to found the Elizabeth Saunders Home for Mixed Blood Children. From the late 1940s to the 1970s, Sawada organized international letter writing campaigns, fundraising campaigns. She sat for interviews in both English and Japanese in print, radio, and television. She wrote 3 books, collaborated on a 4th, published countless articles, traveled the world giving speeches, offered advice and expert testimony to both the United States and Japanese governments, and invited to her home for mixed blood children innumerable scholars, sightseers and gawkers, photographers and movie crews, politicians and bureaucrats, and even Japan's imperial family. In the process, she established herself as a household name in Japan and as the world's leading authority on mixed blood children and their care. People have likened her to a Japanese Mother Teresa, and they have claimed that she deserved the Nobel Prize. Although neither sainthood nor the Nobel Prize were forthcoming, Sawada Miki has been sanctified in other ways, with domestic honors, international awards, and hagiographic depictions in print and television. Now, today I want to complicate that saintly image by reintroducing some of the facts that get smoothed out of the narrative of Sawada Miki's heroic efforts to save Konketsuji and solve Japan's Konketsuji crisis. So, Sawada's first book, which was published in 1953, contains the following anecdote. A Japanese woman and her son appeared at the Saunders home with an infant in their arms. Neither was the parent of that child, and neither had the legal right to dispose of it. However, they gave their reasons for wishing to dispose of it as follows. The infant had been born to the woman's daughter, her grandchild. It was a Konketsuji. They, quote, don't need it, and, quote, the neighbors don't like it. Sawada took the infant and followed the legal procedures appropriate for an abandoned child, creating a new household registry, household of one, and assigning the infant a new name, thereby erasing its original identity. Now, shortly thereafter, the infant's young mother, having discovered from her kin what they had done with her child, arrived at the Saunders home to reclaim her baby, and Sawada turned the mother away. A few days later, the mother came back with a khaki-clad soldier and asked for her baby once again. And at this, Sawada erupted, berating the young woman, demanding that she, quote, learn shame, and refusing to return her baby. Instead, Sawada threatened to involve the police. She told the young mother, quote, if you say it's your own child, you'll be detained for abandonment. If you want it at all costs, file a civil suit after you've taken your punishment. So this was a threat levied against the naive young girl with no family to support her and no ready access to legal counsel. It was levied by a matron born into Japan's wealthiest non-royal family, whose social calendar over the years included birthdays with the emperor, tea with the prime minister, dinner with the Rockefellers, and dancing at Buckingham Palace. So this was a vast differential in power between the two women. There was also a vast differential in each woman's moral standing in the eyes of Japanese society, because the mothers of Konketsuji and other women who were seen boarding with foreign soldiers in the aftermath of World War II were widely despised as ponpon, as whores. Even worse than the average whore, these were women who slept with the enemy. So this was uneven combat, and Sawada Miki was playing to win. Her threat had its intended effect. The young mother gave up, and her child became an orphan. So the actions that Sawada Miki so proudly described in her first book were baldly duplicitous and plainly illegal. But Sawada recounted the tale in the expectation that her readers would approve. And for the most part, it appears that they did. Sawada Miki liked to describe all mixed-blood children as, quote, children who were born uninvited and unloved. But even her own accounts of the mixed-blood children crisis provide ample evidence that many of these mothers loved and dearly wanted to take care of their children. Sawada Miki was never a passive recipient of needy orphans. She took orphans when she could get them, but she also created orphans whenever she saw the need. And she saw the need whenever she saw a konketsuji. Sawada fought many a Japanese mother for custody of her mixed-blood child. That she did so in the limelight and was hailed as a hero for doing it speaks volumes about the triumph of racial nationalism over biosocial kinship and maternal bonds in Japan after World War II. At a time when leading publications and politicians in Japan were advocating the mass removal of konketsuji, Sawada's segregated Saunders home provided a smaller scale venue for excising these children from Japanese kinship and country. By her own account of her confrontation with U.S. Colonel Crawford Sams in 1948, Sawada Miki was possibly the first person to demand that the United States remove all children from the country unilaterally. The nullification of matrilineal bonds with konketsuji was more an advantage than a drawback to this plan. So, to be very clear, under Japanese law, mothers who entrusted children to childcare facilities such as the Saunders home maintained full parental rights, including the right to visit, the right to reclaim that child, and the right to approve or disapprove any potential adoption. Sawada Miki did her utmost to discourage or debar Japanese mothers from exercising those rights. In ways large and small, she interfered with any effort to maintain familial bonds. She insisted that her wards call her mama and that they be told, quote, absolutely nothing about their mothers and fathers. In 1951, she published a long list of complaints about mothers who interfered with her efforts by doing things like visiting their children, providing gifts, toys, or food to those children, or worst of all, taking their children home to live again and be raised as Japanese. By 1952, Sawada had instituted a strict no visitation policy. This was in contravention of the law and of the norms applied to pure-blood children in institutional care. Sawada did not permit Japanese people to adopt her mixed-blood wards, nor did she permit her mixed-blood wards to attend school or socialize with pure-blood children. It was a strict segregation project. In every way she could, Sawada Miki set Konketsuji apart and prepared them with English lessons, baptisms, and steady solicitations to foreigners to be adopted by families across the Pacific. Sawada justified these efforts to both domestic and foreign audiences with the argument that segregating Konketsuji was necessary to shield them from prejudice in the Japanese community. Although the reality was that prejudice was very strongly operating within the walls of the Saunders home. And it's worth noting that Sawada Miki and her many allies in Japan singled out Konketsuji with actual or presumed African-American fathers as particularly alien, dysgenic, and inassimilable. These were the strongest case that was persistently made that Konketsuji could not remain in Japan, had to be moved out of the country. And in part, again, this was allegedly to protect them from Japanese racism. In reality, however, Black Konketsuji sent to America would suffer the dual stigma of Jap and of Jim Crow at a time when in Japan, segregation and discrimination in public schools and other services was already unconstitutional. In the face of considerable criticism, the Liberal Party had rejected segregation as a valid policy measure and was pushing forward with racial integration. So the proposition that in the 1950s, Japan was in some ways actually a more hospitable environment for Black children to grow up in than the United States was something that advocates of international adoption on either side of the Pacific were quite unwilling to contemplate. In its quest for Cold War alliances, the United States was struggling to distance itself from an image of unrepentant racism. American abuse and oppression of non-whites was a frequent topic of condemnation in Japanese presses and politics, and also in Second World and Third World presses around the globe. Sawada Miki herself often raised the issue, condemning discriminatory U.S. immigration controls, bewailing her own pre-war experience of segregated housing and other forms of discrimination in New York City, and so forth. Yet despite all of this, Sawada advocated sending Konketsuji, quote, to America where there is little racial prejudice. And she promoted, quote, adoption by compassionate people of the same race is especially appropriate for Konketsuji with African-American paternity. So while these advocates, Sawada Miki and others, advocates of the removal of Konketsuji from Japan definitely also targeted white Konketsuji, and there's a very binary attitude. There are the white Konketsuji or Black Konketsuji, and there isn't a whole lot of acknowledgement of other possibilities in the post-war era. Black Konketsuji really did animate a heightened level of anxiety and animus. Sawada Miki was only one of many people who were active in fomenting this sense of racial crisis in post-war Japan, but I'd argue that she was uniquely effective in manipulating and managing that crisis because she was able to navigate not only Japanese rancor, but also American guilt. Her message was singular, but it cut in different ways depending on her national audience. In Japan, her message encouraged intolerance for blood mixing and the segregation and expulsion of a stigmatized racial minority. In the United States, her message paradoxically encouraged a burgeoning tolerance for race mixing and for the integration of a racial minority that an increasing number of Americans argued should not be stigmatized at all. When US citizens and policymakers, prodded by Sawada, the Konketsuji crisis, the Cold War, and their own conscience, began to embrace international mixed-race orphans, that embrace helped push forward the beginning of the end of the American tradition of statutory racial segregation, racial bars to immigration, and criminalized controls on miscegenation or race mixing and interracial family formation. By contrast, miscegenation had never been a crime in Japan, where there were some calls to criminalize it in the context of the occupation in early Cold War. But miscegenation was judged as a crime in the court of public opinion after World War II, when mixed blood orphans were made fodder for the Tangitsu Minzoku Shinwa, the dream of a monoracial nation. The same orphans were in the United States made fodder for the dream of a race-blind society. 70 years later, on both sides of the Pacific, we just keep dreaming. Thank you.
Thanks so much. In keeping with our usual practice, one of our associates will ask the first question. So let me turn to Takashi Kojima from the National Police Agency of Japan to pose his opener question. Mr. Kojima this year is working on a project titled Seizure and Analysis of Digital Data in the Context of the Criminal Investigation and Public Safety. Topic a little bit different from what we've heard about today. But still, we're all here to learn about all kinds of things, so please.
Yeah, thank you very much for your fascinating talk. I could learn a lot from your talk, although that I am a person in a different field. And also congratulations for your forthcoming book on that topic. And I have basically two questions. And I understand that the Konketsuji crisis was first provoked by the political parties against the liberal parties and media to attack the pro-US government under the liberal party. But after that, the removal of Konketsuji was occurred through the adoption or migration as a result. And so my question is, to what extent the Japanese government supported the removal of Konketsuji from Japanese community? And the second question is, why did the Japanese government support the removal of the mixed race children through adoption or migration from political point of view? Was that because the government had no choices other than to take this action to obtain the public approval or not? This is a question. And I have the different third question. And if the Sanders House played an important role in segregating Konketsuji from the Japanese community, so what drove Sawada Miki to hold such a the Sanders House? Did she do that of her free will due to her Christianity, or was she forced or manipulated to do so by somebody thinking about her husband's job? So they are my question from me.
Thank you. Great questions. So on the first question, did the Japanese government support the removal of Konketsuji and why? I mean, they definitely had to cooperate, right? The United States is in no position to do this unilaterally. So I think that there are two factors. And for one thing, there's this argument that's ongoing within Japan's government, right? Not everybody is of the same mind. So the Liberal Party is very much on the defensive. As much as possible, they would like this problem to go away. And to some extent, then it might be convenient if the children go away. That is not their officially stated position, but they don't interfere, right? They don't interfere. And there are other organs of government, particularly the Ministry of Welfare, is actually quite eager and does a lot of the footwork in their nationwide surveys. They go out to try to find every single mixed blood child that has been born since the end of World War II. And they specifically have surveyors ask every single family, are you willing to give up your child for international adoption? And so they're the ones who end up working closely with different adoption agencies in the United States and different family courts in Japan to try to facilitate, make it as easy as possible to move children overseas. And one of the things I explain in my book is the rise of the Ministry of Welfare and the fact that it was populated with a great many eugenicists, some of whom were strong advocates of a pure blood ideology. Really did work very hard to define blood mixing as a eugenic threat to Japan. So you can see some of their influence in the ways that Konketsuji get treated after World War II. As to Sawada Miki's motives, I don't think she was in any way manipulated into, I think she was a true believer. And I think she was a very strong personality and difficult to manipulate if you tried. She's going to do what she's going to do. And I'm really not sure what her husband thought, what Sawada Denzo thought about what she was up to. It seems like their marriage might not have been the most intimate. It's an arranged marriage, it's a convenient marriage, but it seems like they sort of went on two different paths at some point in their lives. So she's able to sort of use some of the diplomatic connections that their family has and use a lot of the political connections that they have to her own ends. But I'm not convinced that Sawada Denzo was an enthusiastic supporter, and I can't say for sure either way. But to speak a little bit more about her motives, I think they're complex. I think that she, like a lot of Japanese people, had a bit of an axe to grind with the United States at the end of World War II. So one of her sons, and apparently her favorite son, was killed in World War II in service against the United States. He's killed in the Pacific. He was in the Navy. Also, I think not at all irrelevant, the Mitsubishi Zaibatsu, its assets, her family's assets, are seized by the United States and redistributed during the occupation. And she's deeply resentful of that, and also of the sort of assault on her family's reputation. And she is pretty open about it. The very first trip that she takes to the United States, where she's doing a sort of press tour to talk about Konketsuji and to raise money, she also says, like, my primary goal was to get back some of our family's assets. That is what she wanted most to talk to American legislators about. Although her father told her, like, forget it. Like, this is a non-starter, but she's not willing to give up on it. So I think she had a series of complaints, right, beyond blood mixing itself, that motivated her to take this project on and keep up the argument for many, many years.
Marla?
Yeah, thank you so much for this talk. It was really interesting. And I have two related, I think, questions that kind of go slightly into the wartime period rather than the post-war period, which is that you said that the kind of the reception of the idea of blood mixing, or like, I'm saying blood mixing because the racialization, this is the question I have, changed across the wartime divide, but did also kind of the method of classification or the logic by which people were being racialized change in the process. And then this is connected to the second question, which is that, so what about non-white, non-Black Konketsuji, like Asian Konketsuji? And I'm thinking both about Zainichi Korean children and Zainichi Chinese children, but also about children that were orphaned or born to Japanese soldiers abroad, but then some of them, I think, were also repatriated or denied repatriation in the post-war period. So how were they conceived of their presence in Japan?
Yeah, thank you. This is, the conceptualization of blood mixing does change, and some of the categorization changes too. So in the imperial era, blood mixing is not exclusively, but most often linked to a kind of Pan-Asian discourse. And the idea that as Japanese expand, I mean, there are active, it's not just sort of propaganda, there are active government policies that are designed to encourage Japanese to mix blood or to intermarry with different people as in different regions of Japan. And so blood mixing in that era is most often referring to mixing between Japanese and Ainu, or Japanese and Koreans, or Japanese and Chinese, Japanese, and it can apply to anybody, Japanese plus anybody, right, equals blood mixing. And often in the imperial era, this is celebrated as kind of like a thing that's going to bind everyone in Japan together into one big happy imperial family, right? And a lot of eugenicists spend a lot of time explaining how this will actually make the race stronger, healthier, more fit to inhabit all of these diverse lands if they're mixing blood with all of these diverse people. So what shifts after, by the end of World War II is with the collapse of empire, right? Blood mixing with these other peoples no longer seems as relevant. There's a lot less conversation about it than there used to be, and there's sort of reorientation. So you almost always hear Konketsuji described as either white or Black. So the older sense of sort of Pan-Asian blood mixing kind of collapses. It doesn't disappear altogether because there is quite a bit of talk, and Sawada Miki herself talks about it at times, about what about all of the children that the Japanese soldiers did sire and leave behind in places like Indonesia and the Philippines and China and so forth. So there's a really interesting conversation that was published between a member of the Japan Socialist Party, Fujiwara Michiko, and Sawada Miki, because Fujiwara Michiko goes on a sort of tour of all of these former colonized and occupied lands, to survey what's up with the Konketsuji that Japan left behind. And she and Sawada agree that, well, basically, these children aren't a problem because they're the best children. They're the pride of their mothers and the pride of their race. They're eugenically superior to the pure children in those nations. So that in some ways, they're keeping alive the old imperial discourse that blood mixing is for the good. But this is really based on a notion of Japanese supremacy, that they've donated superior Japanese genes to all of these other people, and so there's no problem. There's no reaction against it, and there's no need to do anything to sort of solve the problem. And the one exception that they admit is in the Philippines, where they say there's such strong anti-Japanese sentiment in the Philippines that mixed blood children there and their mothers are really strongly discriminated against. So Fujiwara Michiko, this member of the Japan Socialist Party, is one of the few who stands up in the Diet because she's aware and she's paying close attention to these sorts of problems in former lands that were occupied by Japan. She's the one who stands up in the Diet and says, look, as sympathetic as I am with our party's demands that the United States, some people were saying you got to remove all of these children. Others were saying that the United States should indemnify Japan for the costs of raising these children. And Fujiwara Michiko said, be very, very careful. We cannot demand an indemnity from the United States because that would open us up to similar claims from all of these other countries, and we don't want that. So just don't do it. And she helped to organize some sort of private channels for dealing with the mixed blood children that Japan had left behind overseas. But there's not a whole lot of public attention to that. There's much more interest in the mixed blood children who were left in Japan than the mixed blood children Japan had left behind. Right?
I see several hands. Let me just jump in with a quick question from one of our viewers in Zoom land. Ayagoto, were there any family planning efforts to avoid konketsuji pregnancy in the first place? And the questioner is doing research on reproductive health issues in Japan herself.
Yes, thank you so much for asking. I have an entire chapter where I talk about this. And so some of you may know about the Eugenic Protection Law, which was passed in 1948 and partially decriminalizes abortion in Japan. And that is followed up by family planning efforts. The Eugenic Protection Law, I make an argument that part of the point actually of the Eugenic Protection Law, and you can find evidence of this like testimony by the people who were, the legislators who were instrumental in designing and passing that law, specifically state that one of the points of their effort was to make it possible to abort konketsuji. And so we also have strong evidence that there was a nationwide campaign coordinated by the Ministry of Welfare to abort konketsuji when possible. After that campaign, and then it's an illegal campaign, actually. Abortion is still illegal when the Ministry of Welfare organizes that from 1945 on to 1948. Afterwards, when abortion is more readily accessible, there's just a whole lot of social pressure exerted on Japanese women to abort if they're having sex with foreign soldiers. And I cite a lot of the press coverage, extremely negative coverage of any Japanese woman who is so foolish or so selfish as to give birth to a live child that she should have aborted.
Thanks. So I saw Ian and Joel and Nakano-san.
Thank you. I'll go quick because Marla stole the best question of all. So that's the great thing about having really smart graduate students in the room. Thank you. That question of continuity from the Pan-Asianist discourse and racialized ethnic nationalist discourse into the post-war strikes me as really salient and important. So in the spirit of riffing on the great question from a great student, I want to center Sawada. I think she's really, and I was hoping that Hiromu Nagahara was on the Zoom call because he's doing a lot of work on kind of folks of Sawada's class background, right? And they're kind of neglected in the literature and the historiography, or they're treated as somehow incidental or expressions of deeper instances or dynamics rather than agents in their own right. And so that's really interesting. And it was a relief. I'm sorry to be late, but to come in and hear Sawada being discussed was wonderful because I think it gets right to these central questions. So thinking about Sawada in particular in the context of Marila's question, I mean, I'm at a certain level, I'm not surprised at all by most of the fundamental dynamics that she's working with. These are things that have clear precedent echoes in pre-war attitudes and behaviors around imperial relationships and so on. And so really interesting to hear you work your way into her stuff and her thought. Three simple questions or not so simple questions, probably not simple because what happens when we layer social class into her kind of engagement? In particular, and this is the second question, the Don family and this is where Hiromu comes in. Of this generation, Sawada would have been in those rooms at those balls with the imperial family, with the children of Katama and Jindan in particular, who were Japanese American. And Jin was the Showa emperor's probably one of the top 3 scientific influences on his much studied engagement with marine biology and so on. So in the imperial circle, in the most intimate realms, or not the most, the second circle around the imperial person, are 3 folks who fit the categories that Sawada herself is discussing, coming from exceptionally elite background. And then the third is really incidental and probably impossible to know, but what is Sawada Miki reading? So I'm curious, because she's an intellectual in the ways you've brought her to us. She's a policymaker. I want to treat her the same ways we might treat similar folks in the ways the literature handles intellectual history. What is the bibliography she's working with? How is she engaging in the ways that Nakano or someone of that ilk might have been studied?
Okay, great, thank you. Great questions. So a lot of the people that I study, the eugenicists, are really great, and even a lot of the policymakers are really great at citing their sources. So I know exactly who they're reading. Sawada doesn't do that. But I still know some of the people that she's talking to. I know some of the eugenicists she's talking to because she invites them into the Saunders home to conduct many, many years of studies on Konketsuji. And so if she doesn't cite them by name, I know from their publications, they cite her home and they thank her. And you can track like particular orphans that she talks about in her books. They're the same particular orphans that these eugenicists are talking about, right? And then she incorporates some ideas from these eugenicists and explains, for instance, at the opening of, I think it's her first book in 1953, she says, it's well known among eugenicists that Konketsuji are highly represented among criminal types, like the first person to ever be, I think she says, the first person to ever be given the death penalty in the Philippines was a Konketsuji. Like, this is the way she opens her talk. And this pops up and again and again and again in Sawada Miki's many published pieces. Her constant, and I don't know if she's reading the studies that they publish. I mean, honestly, they're extremely dry. I'm probably the only person who wants to read these studies, but she's talking to them and she's taking it in, right? So this question of social class, I think, matters tremendously to Sawada Miki. And therefore, she's not entirely consistent on the question of race. So there's an odd moment in one of the books that she publishes in the 1950s, where she has this very nostalgic romantic view of her own family's history, and she's trying, using her newfound fame as a way to sort of retell her family's history and I think polish their image again, because it's taken a bit of a beating under the occupation. And one of the stories she tells is about how, her father, of course, had all kinds of foreign friends, like very powerful international business leader. And she talks about one American in particular who constantly visited Japan and visited their family. And the men in the family would take these foreign guests to visit geisha. And so she describes this particular American man, and I don't remember his name, gets this Japanese woman pregnant, and then he goes home. And so Sawada Miki tells this story, oddly enough, with an approving tone, because she says, well, before he left, he told my father to take care of it, take care of this woman and the baby. So in this case, for some reason that has something to do with class, it has something to do with family ties, she's fine with it. In other instances, she's really aggressively dismissive of both Japanese and Americans when they display the wrong kind of class. Sometimes she describes them as having the manners of a downtown maid. I don't exactly know. I don't have any kind of maid downtown or uptown, so I don't fully know what but I think it's an insult. I think it's a class marker. Sounds like it. There are times when she turns away potential American adoptees because, this woman walks in wearing shorts and chewing bubble gum. And to Sawada Miki, this is outrageous. How dare she, right? So class politics is absolutely central to what she's doing. And just one more example of the kinds of complaints that she levied against. I think it's in her first book when she says, when I went to the United States back in the day, I made so many good friends, but where are all of the good people, the good Americans that I used to know? Everyone I'm meeting in Japan now reminds me of the people lined up in the Great Depression asking for a handout. So her class prejudice is really, really deep. And I will say that you can kind of square the circle and bring class back into sort of eugenic and racial attitudes, because eugenicists are also deeply class conscious. And a lot of the eugenic theory in Japan about blood mixing was very, very particular about what class of people from each race is mixing. And lower class people mixing is horrific. Upper class people mixing may get an exception. It may be okay.
So we have 3 more people, 5 minutes. Everybody is nice. Joel.
Hi, I'm Joel. I'm a postdoc at the Reich Institute. I'll try and quick. The last term, Yuri Dulin gave a great talk about Korean returning adoptees. And he contrasted the US bases in Japan allowing Japanese wives, you can tell me if this is true or not, and in Korea, they didn't allow this because of a different idea about the Koreans not being suitable for doing that. And there was, anyway, but in Japan, that was okay. So I was wondering how that was different. Those families were different to the children being adopted. I'll skip my second question. The third one is, for children that grew up in these institutions, do you have, I guess they're pretty old now. Do you have things that they said about their time there, and what did some of them go on to do interesting things and talk about themselves as mixed race or konketsuji? Thank you.
Yeah, so children's voices, we do have some instances of this, and their reactions to the process are mixed, right? Sawada seemed to have favorites. She would treat different children quite differently. And so some of them recall her with fondness and others not at all, right? So I think for some children, it was deeply traumatic. And her third and final book actually tells a lot of the dark stories, because by that time, a lot of the children who had not been adopted overseas had grown up, they'd graduated from the home, and they end up in the newspapers a lot as criminals. They keep getting arrested for committing all of these crimes. And so she has to sort of account for what went wrong in her institution, and she ends up blaming the children. And she tells all of these stories that, if you read Against the Grain, are accounts of like deep institutional trauma that's inflicted on these children and deep racism that they're suffering from. And the more I read of her accounts, the more sympathetic I am with the children rather than with her. So to get back to your first question about Japanese wives, is the question, were Japanese wives allowed on U.S. bases?
No, it's been, from what I understood, they were able to live as family units on the US bases, American soldiers with Japanese wives, and presumably their children. And was this treated differently to the outside the base?
So they were not at first. At first, the United States military, because they're liable to U.S. law, which depends on state law governing. It's illegal, right, in a lot of states for a white or Black Americans to engage in interracial sex or marriage. So the United States military is very, very nervous about these guys and tries to prevent them from contracting marriages that are going to be illegal if they try to move back to the United States. But eventually the resistance kind of crumbles, because even though state laws are not modifying all that quickly, the national conversation is modifying really, really quickly. So I do think that there's a little bit from the Japanese side, a little bit more of a potential for a positive point of view about Japanese women who actually marry and settle down with U.S. soldiers. But even then, there's a lot of testimony from these women that even if they do get married, they're still kind of assumed to have been whores to begin with. There's something wrong with them.
So we're down to like 2 minutes. If you could ask your questions quickly and ask. Okay, Nakano-san.
Yeah, my more important question was the class issue question. So that's taken care of. The one that's related is unfortunately less central to your own research, but I think it's still very important. I'm quite surprised to see the change of attitude in the United States in terms of immigration, but also in terms of miscegenation and all that sort of thing. Because of course, by the 1920s and 30s for sure, American racism was also very much to do with the class issue. And, year of peril, the Japanese laborers or what have you, they are particularly unwanted. And in this case, given that there are also African-American soldiers, maybe not uniquely, but also them fathering children with prostitutes, and I guess in the frame of thing at the time, with somebody of a lesser race and adopting them, that seems to be a huge jump from what you would imagine of pre-war attitude. So what explains that, I wonder?
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you, when I read, congressional records, I think a lot of U.S. legislators also felt it was a huge jump. Like, they're getting whiplash, like they're real surprised, and they call in to testify on these changes in immigration law that are being proposed and passed, like U.S. labor leaders. And they keep asking, like, wait, are you sure you're in favor of opening up immigration to, are you sure? Because for decades now, I've been holding the line because you told me to absolutely not let in like Japanese migrants, right? Because they're going to take US jobs. And so it is a moment, I think, where things are shifting so quickly that even people in Washington are confused. But part of it is coming from, I think there is a real, Cold War Orientalism, this sense that the United States really needs to build these alliances, even if you're personally uncomfortable. You have to take a certain kind of public stand. And I do think it matters a lot that U.S. servicemen and veterans are at the front of the line asking for these demands. One of the kinds of immigration that was still absolutely prohibited on the books, if you're trying to get like a war bride into the United States, even after they start allowing Japanese war brides into the United States, you still have to do a sort of morality check. Was she a prostitute? And what's interesting is that I've found congressional records that say openly, yes, this woman was a prostitute. However, he's married her and he wants to bring her home. And Congress says, okay, then. They really don't want to say no to these guys. So I think that kind of grassroots pressure starts to move things pretty quickly.
Maybe love conquers all. Yes, who knows?
Cold War.
Cold War conquers.
Yeah.
Well, you can take your choice of either a heartwarming conclusion. So with that, I think we have to bring this to an end. It's been a really interesting session. Thanks so much, Kristin, and thank you all for joining us today.